Hello, everybody. My name is Rhys Giles, and I am the head of product strategy here at Fuse. I'm here today and joined by Craig Weiss, the CEO and founder of findanlms.com. Hi, Craig.
Hi, sorry, I was on mute.
That's fine. That's fine. We'll get it out of the way now. So Craig is going to be talking to us, as you see on the screen, around the learning battle. So LMS versus LXP versus learning platform. Before I hand over to Craig, just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping and just a little bit about Fuse Universal at the very beginning. So at Fuse, we have a focus on building engaging learning that drives performance. And rather than using traditional learning courses that you see on traditional learning management systems, we focus on giving you tools and functionality around microlearning assets. So it allows users to get back to the knowledge that they need to do their job better in the flow of work. We do also, already have the learning management functionality as well that you would expect, but we also have things such as performance management. We have recommendations and machine learning built in to the platform to make sure that users can get to the right content for them in the minimal amount of time possible. Alongside that, we also have performance management, so coaching, one-to-ones, and we've also got world-class analytics, which we've just recently launched to a select group of clients as well. And that tracks engagement, consumption, and performance down to the individual level. It's really, really powerful to be able to see the changes that you're actually making using these analytical dashboards. And as we go on, I'd love to, and I'm really interested to find out what Craig's thoughts are on where he would position a platform such as Fuse, which I'm sure we're going to find out. Now, before we dive into that webinar, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So we really want a great interactive session. We really want you to be asking questions. So you can do that on Zoom, as you can see at the bottom of the screen using the Q&A button. And then when you have this little dialog box on the right come up, type your question into that. I'll be monitoring the box, so I'll be able to talk to you through the different questions and answers. And then once we're at the end of Craig's presentation, we'll pause and then we'll take the questions there. Now, you can ask questions on the presentation for Craig. You can also ask questions around Fuse if you want, and I can answer those at the end of the session as well. So it is being recorded. You will be able to actually see all of this afterwards as well. So if you want to download and send to somebody else, you can also do that. And I think this is a great opportunity now to hand over to Craig. So Craig, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome from Los Angeles. If you end up hearing something barking in the background, I apologize. 3 dogs, and they do open the door. So I want to welcome you here to our topic, which is going to be covering learning systems. And under learning systems, as it relates to our topic today, our learning management systems, which is the biggest segment of the market, learning experience, which you might know as LXP, learning platform, we'll talk about sort of why vendors will call themselves that. Sales enablement will lightly touch on. This is a relatively new niche. They're called Sales Enablement Platforms. And excuse me, if you read my blog, then you today or yesterday when it came out, you'll probably know that I believe the term LXP should be rebranded as a digital learning platform. But in the case of this presentation, I will refer to it as an LXP. So we're going to be talking about, what are the benefits of each one of the systems and what are the challenges that each system faces. Next slide, please. So the biggest 3 here, and I relate that based on market, is a number of systems. So there's a little bit over 1,300 systems worldwide through a variety of different categories. And there are people that call their system, a variety of different things that's not in any category. And that's a way to just try to stand out in a crowd, try to get people to pay attention to them. Excuse me. So the big ones here is LMS, Learning Platform, LXP. And the way, I'm sorry, just one second, please. Sometimes that happens when you present. So the way to kind of look at it is that a learning platform, people will tend to refer to that as sort of the anti-LMS, right? So they'll say, you know, I'm not a traditional LMS. And then, of course, you have LMS vendors saying I'm not a traditional LMS. But a learning platform, I find, tends to be very streamlined. Many are, I would say, in the last 2 years, if you look at that segment, you'll see a lot of learning platforms come out, as well as the LMS and LXP, but that's kind of where they zero in. And functionality wise, they're pretty close to an LMS. So I have like 16 standards to be an LMS. There are plenty of learning platforms that are really, they either have it or they're pretty close. And then there's some that just aren't even close. So it's sort of this catch-all if you don't want to be in these other two categories. It can be both for customers and employees. I tend to find more of them gearing themselves to an employee. And a percentage of them actually are targeting at a lower price point, but not all of them. The LMS market as a whole, I'm sure you're very familiar with, but you know there's some misinterpretation or misundings about an LMS. So an LMS are systems I used to always buy when I worked at a bunch of different companies, and I used it for personal and professional development. So that for employees and then our customers as well. And then we also sold content to our customers. So we provided customer training too. I never used it for compliance, ever, never used it for that. Required, there would be some, depending on where I worked, we would have some stuff for required rather than, you know, proprietary based. And some of the requirements they have, and that's what I used it for. And there are quite a number of people who do the same thing I did and doing. So it's not just about compliance. And this is where I think a lot of people get confused. If you're going to use a system as clients, that's your prerogative. But generally speaking, it's really best if you look at, you know, research, personal and professional development is the best route to go to retain employees. That said, when someone says to me traditional LMS, I already know what they're thinking of. Saba, SumTotal, Cornerstone, and SuccessFactors. And each one of these are human capital management systems. Learning is a component of the first three. They're doing a lot with the learning piece. And so that's another thing. Systems can be 15 years old and be more cutting edge than a system that's out 6 weeks. But there are plenty of LMSs that are just awful. I mean, I would never buy SuccessFactors, but that's your prerogative. LXPs are sort of the fastest growing of the segments. The average age for them is just barely over a year, and there's plenty of new ones coming in. And the way I look at an LXP, if you strip everything down, excluding functionality, they have to have content. So they're a content aggregator, which means they have to have partnerships with a variety of content providers, third-party content providers. It can be fee-based or it can be free. If they don't have that, then they slide into a learning platform for the most part. And with the LMS, what ends up happening is, and you'll see more and more of this, is the LXPs are coming ubiquitous with an LMS. And what I tend to find with an LXP, if I look at the entire market, is that they tend not to have certain functionality. Like they usually don't have classroom management. So if that's sort of what you want to do, an LXP is not for you. They heavily target learning and development. That is a big piece, and we'll talk about the minus of doing that when they only focus on that segment. They're strictly really heavily towards employee training. That's not to say that if you want to provide your customers content, you can, but you can't charge people. They don't have e-commerce as a whole in these platforms. So you can't charge people the content anyway. You have to buy it as the client, and then you provide it free to your audience. So, you know, if I was looking at that, can one system do everything? An LMS possibly could if it has enough functionality, and they're trying to add content like an LXP. An LXP really is heavily driven to customers. We'll talk about, though, here shortly, what is really an ideal market they want into that they don't they don't make it public. So there's that kind of piece in there. And a learning platform tries to hit both markets. They tend to drive more towards employees, for those three pieces. Next slide, please. So let's look at the quick comparison, and this is very high level. As I talked about, the LXPs, they have to have the marketplace. But you know what some systems will do in the LXPs, and I'll name about 5 that will stand out here in just a couple of seconds, is that they think quantity is the route people want to go. So it's not uncommon for them to say, we have 50,000 assets, we have 5,000 assets, we have, 400 types of content, different content providers, including free and fee-based. And so it gives that illusion that more content is better. But for me, it's always about the quality of the content, not the quantity, right? Because if you have Sky, wherever you might be living, I mentioned Sky TV in the UK, cable here, satellite, even if you cut the cord, there's lots of channels. But most people tend to watch like the same 4 or 5 channels, right? If you're surfing the internet, I think most people tend to have like maybe 5 or 6 sites they go to all the time. They're not surfing the entire internet. So that's the thing, but they have to have that. The learning environment tends to be, when I look at the functionality of learning environment nowadays, they pretty much have, most of them are matching what an LMS has. But that being said, they tend not to necessarily have like a search where you can assign multiple roles to a person. That's from a learner side of thing. Many of them don't have that. But generally speaking, it's all about that learning environment. So you're going to see a very beautiful front end for the learner. It's going to be very modern. A lot of them are jumping into sort of the Netflix. In fact, pretty much everybody is in the LXP space. So it's all about that Netflix kind of experience that you see. They're very big into what's our next thing, playlist. Now, a vendor could call it channels, but most of them call it playlist. And they have specific types of playlists. So every LXP on the market has this. Now, they may use different vernacular. They're going to have most recommended or top recommendation. And that's content that comes in based on an algorithm. So they all use some form of a machine learning algorithm. They're going to have that. They're going to have most popular, which isn't necessarily recommended, right? So recommended is based on what the person is taking, whether they've completed or not. Some vendors require it to be completed, which I think is a mistake. But they go ahead and they can take it, and then the system says, okay, based on all these variables, this is what the system recommends. And then most popular is based on what the end users are taking the most of. That's one of the things. The next thing they'll have is, besides most popular, they may have, based on the topic. So the whole point of an LXP is they're supposed to push this whole kind of learner-centric mentality. And if you think about it, it's heavy geared towards personal and professional development. That's one of the big things they push about an LXP, because they're targeting L&D people that are using an LMS for compliance required training. So they've added this content about the personal professional development. And one of the things they do early on when you use the systems is they'll ask the learner to pick areas of interest and or topics. And so what happens is that when they'll have a playlist based on those areas of interest. So if I'm into sales, they'll have a variety of things that are available. there possibly could drill down even further. I could have multiple playlists at any given time. And I'll even have a playlist for content I'm currently working on. Even if you get into aside, which is sort of the question of how long is it really learner-centric. But they have all those kinds of things that are going into it. And that's one of the powers of the playlist, because again, everything is wrapped around content curation. The playlists are wrapped around the content, and the content could be any form of media, which is a lot of it's video driven, but it doesn't have to be. So media today can mean a variety of different things. It's not necessarily just about video, but everything is driven around that content piece. You don't really find as a whole, more and more of them are accepting SCORM. XAPI is relatively, not universal with them, but they, what I tend to find with people is they're not necessarily creating content using a third-party authoring tool. That right now is not something that's overly consistent with an LXP, even though you can do that. And everything is tied around skills development, skill ratings, expanding on your skill sets. They like to kind of push the whole mastery learning thing, which I personally have found to be ineffective, in my opinion. But they necessarily just drive home that whole aspect of skills, right? Because when you think about it, what's personal and professional development? Personal and professional development is skill sets. I'm wanting to learn a new skill. And it's based on the premise, again, is I have an interest, right? So if I'm interested in something, the probability that I'm going to go back and take that content over and over again is pretty high. If I'm not interested in it, I'm just clicking through it. So that's kind of the angle. They're heavily driven towards employees. The dirty little secret is that they want the customer market. They want the multi-tenant market, what we call sometimes extended enterprise. They want into that space. But they're so driven on the employee side because they target L&D. And this gets into a kind of another challenge they're facing is more and more of them are adding assigned training. So I, as the person behind the scenes, the client, if I'm, L&D or training, but if I'm L&D primary, I can say, okay, you have to complete this content, and that's pushed as a playlist. And to me, that's a question is it still learner-centric if you're telling me what I have to take? That's kind of where you're getting into utilizing it. Their preference is to be an add-on, which means while again, they do have customers that only use them as a whole, they tend to be a bolt-on. So somebody already has an LMS. Somebody already has a learning platform. Somebody already has whatever other kind of system out there, and they're looking for an add-on because they don't feel that the LMS or the product that they're else using, right, has all those kind of capabilities. Or if I'm using an LMS for only compliance, and that's all I see it as, then this is perfect. I can bolt on these LXPs and then push and pull between the two. Just 1 second, please. An LMS, the reason I mentioned content first strategy is that now that's what they're pushing. So this is how they look at the aspect of content first strategy. So when I talk to Cornerstone, this is their strategy. When I talk to SumTotal, this is their strategy. When I have done a random with a variety of LMS vendors in all different markets, it's all about content first strategy. Why? In today's world, as in 2019, content, even though it's a commodity, and it has been for years, is what's driving everything, right? And it makes sense because if you really drill down on why people don't like their systems, two things pop up. Number one reason is support. That's always been. The second thing is when I drill down to people, what I tend to find is also content, and they blame the system on the content. So it's all about content. We've noticed about blended, pretty much 90+% of the LMSs out there are going to have classroom management at some level, which is used for instructor-led training. Next generation, when I do sort of my variety tiers, I think as a whole, LMSs tend to have more next generation functionality than LXPs. That's not to say every LXP doesn't have that, but when you're looking at sort of what I consider different types of tiers of next generation functionality, I tend to find it with more of the LMS market. Again, that's not every system that's out there. Learning and administration, when I do my analysis and I compare the two pieces, what I'm finding, at least today, is, again, there's some administration functionality and LXP doesn't have as a whole. Again, there are some that do have it. An example of some, by the way, LXPs would be Degreed, EdCast, LearnAmp, which is out of the United Kingdom. My blank is kind of going in. Of course, Me is another kind of LXP. 360 Learning is one. Corp Academy is one, and the list kind of goes on. LMSs, there's a variety of them. The other differentiators I find is LMSs, again, as a whole, not everybody, but as a whole, tend to have more metrics and data capabilities than an LXP. And one of the factors is that the LRSs tend to be more in an LMS than, say, an LXP. They're not all leveraging an LRS. But just in the metrics, when you look at data visualization, I tend to find it really strong in LMS. There are exceptions. So Instilled, LXP, they use an LRS. So they're adding more kind of metric capabilities that exist in there. But as a whole, if you really want strong reporting, you're really into heavy with metrics and analytics, and LMS is probably your best bet. If you're into e-commerce and you're focused, if I was doing customer training, I would buy an LMS. I wouldn't buy an LXP, and I wouldn't buy a learning platform. So there are plenty of LMSs that actually just provide customer training. That's all they do. E-commerce is usually in an LMS. Again, it's not universal. Skills management, you can go into both. Again, sorry about the dog in the background. You can go into both of them, and skills management tends to have, has replaced competencies. So it's just a different phrasing. It tends to be a little bit higher with the LXPs, but it's not universal. Like skill ratings, I tend to find more LXPs starting to offer that than, say, an LMS. Digital learning, this is a variety of sets of media. And again, I think that an LXP piece is sort of driven in that kind of aspect. And then add-ons, this is like something kind of brand new, I think, in the market. This is sort of APIs. And then, so instead of you going to get SurveyMonkey and you want to put it in your system, it already exists, and then it's sort of just a plug and play. I tend to find, as a whole, LMSs have more add-ons that sort of have those more kind of APIs ready to go than LXPs. And lastly, on the markets, the thing to recognize is that, and we'll get into this in the next slide, enterprise means whatever a vendor wants it to mean. So there are vendors that see enterprise as 301 people. Cornerstone sees it as 5,000 or more. When you're doing, if you look at Department of Labor in multiple countries on that term they use, they say enterprise is 10,000 or more, but those days are gone. So when I look at the markets, what I tend to find is that the LXPs are better suited for what we call mid-market, which is, if we're using today's terminology, would be between 1,000 and 2,500. In reality, a mid-market is 1,000 to 9,999. But again, it's based on variance. LMSs can be all the way across the board. And there are plenty of LXPs that are having 100,000, 200,000, 1 million people. But generally speaking, that's kind of where I think their sweet spot is. Next, please.
Craig, just before we move on, do you mind if I just jump in? I thought they made a really interesting point around content, and I think the way that I've always seen LXPs is very much around the content marketplace piece, and the fact that you can have 500,000 assets from various different third-party providers. But the difficulty I've always found with these kind of things is that it's generic content, and so people are not necessarily having specific skill gaps, or I suppose their company-based training. The knowledge that exists inside a company can really help people from that as well. So just providing a suite of generic learning from LinkedIn, while it's great as supplemental, you still need to have, I think, a much deeper content strategy than that. I think a term that we're starting to see more now is around nano knowledge, and how you just get back to an answer, whether it's an answer around a process or around something to do with a skill, rather than necessarily having to take an entire course. You need to be building content at the different layers. So the nano layer, the micro layer where it is a video asset, and then the course layer, the macro layer that sits on top of that. So it's what we're finding with a lot of clients at the moment is people are starting to realize that if they want to really nudge performance and get people to think about that in a much better way, then they need to start to build assets at the lowest common level and have a system that's going to allow you to pull out the answer to a question, as well as serve a video, as well as serve a course on top of that.
But they've always been able to do that, right? So what you're describing is not new. Microlearning started in the late 90s. Scenario-based learning is really ideal. Very few vendors do that. And so if I'm doing leadership development, for example, and I may have content that's available from another marketplace, right? So a content marketplace, again, gets back into the whole thing about content aggregation. It is a marketplace. You're going through your picking, right? If I select TED, or I'm selecting, whatever it might, that which is free, that goes in there. I see vendors having Udemy, and Coursera. Those are MOOCs, which is, right? A MOOC is horrible, in my opinion, right? It uses a syllabus. Nobody completes these things. They got famous experts, which doesn't mean anything, so they go into this. And my preference, which I don't see a lot, is skills can be anything, right? If I want to learn a certain thing about Excel, and you have a piece of content, for example, if you're focusing on short content, it should focus on one specific piece, like how to add labels. That's all it should be. It shouldn't be 9 different things, and it should be engaging and immersive. So a lot of this content that I see, which is coming from the providers, right, is not engaging and immersive as a whole. It's really not. And so, what you're talking is there are a couple of systems out there that allow their customers to create the content and then put it in the marketplace. And then they can either sell it or not. And, I do kind of want to hit something about technical training. Technical training, which I've done plenty of, is immersive and interactive as a whole, but I have found plenty that are just screenshots and text. And there are providers that just offer that, right? So regardless of it's an LXP, LMSs have marketplaces. It used to be I would call you. That's how it worked in the early 2000s and through, but more and more of them are starting to have it as visual. And so if I'm doing Microsoft, not everybody has Office 365, for example. Many of them don't. If I'm doing something like, LinkedIn Learning has content, good, bad, or otherwise, but they have some stuff that's outdated. And what I find with the content providers, again, as a whole, is that they will be adding the content, which is fine, but they don't clean up the old content. So you've got stuff in there that's horrible and outdated, and they don't, what I call, cull it. And I think really the best kind of thing to do is if, for example, I'm doing a gender workplace study, which will come out in September, dealing with female executives. And what I tend to find is there is one content provider, and all the content providers that I've looked at around the world, there is one that has leadership specifically for women. And leadership development for women is different than for men. And that, as a case in point. And when I talk to female executives, I found pretty universally, not all of them, but enormously many of them, that they believe in having gender-specific content because they do think in different types of roles that is relevant, right? And what I tend to find is, right, sales, cold calling is cold calling. There's certain topics that are just consistent. I would like to see if I'm an LMS and I'm focusing on the financial market, then the only content I think you should have is about stuff tied to financial services. If I'm an LXP and I have a variety of different content providers, whether it's video, PDFs, ebooks, people popping out of books, whatever it might be, then what I should have is that not just my general, but very specific, right? Because you're basing it on what is the interest of the learner.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I find consumers make a huge mistake. They focus on what they think their learners are interested in. And I always say, how do you know what people are interested in? And the other thing is people are very much driven today by what we call linear learning, which is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that approach that you have to complete the content. But the fact is, I always use this as an example. How many people go and read a newspaper, read a magazine, even if it's online, and read every single article? It's rare these days. People just focus on what they're interested in, leave. And then if I'm doing there's this book out there called an Excel Bible. It's over 1,000 pages. I'm not going to read everything. I'm only focused on what I'm interested in. And if I'm doing technical training, for example, I'm only going to focus on what I'm interested in. The reason instructor-led training is not as effective as web-based training, regardless of what on the topic, but definitely with technical training, is I don't know what level these people are at in terms of how much are they retaining. They could be on the first screen still trying to figure out something, and I'm being driven by the instructor.
Yeah.
So why should I then have that content if I'm in the system follow that same mantra? If I'm interested, again, if it's a basic Excel course and I'm only interested in labels, then allow me to go to labels and allow me to go back 5,000 times or 20 times. And when I look at the metrics, I always was interested on where the person is going in the content by chapter, which a lot of content that consumers make do not put table of contents in there. And I've seen it with content providers, which is a mistake. What area they're going into and how many times they're going in. If they're going in 30 seconds and they keep going there every single time, I know that that's a skill gap. That's what they're interested in. And I have to look upon that. So this isn't about, technical of, creating labs, for example. That's something that could be done, but the systems don't drive that thing. They have to look at everybody, right? If I want something very specific, there is an LMS out there today. All they provide is compliance. And they don't have social and they don't have any of those other things. But most people kind of want those pieces. And I always say that, when you're going in and out of content, if that's all it was about, then they wouldn't have social. They wouldn't have gamification. They wouldn't have any of these extra pieces. And that's when I look at engagement, I want to know what are they engaging in besides the content? Because most people just go and leave. And so that's where you have to go in. And today, as a whole, the LMSs can achieve, depending on what functionality, to go in there beyond the LMS.
It's interesting. I think we could probably do a webinar just on this particular point, couldn't we? And I can see there's some comments as well, so I'm going to go and chat. If you do have any comments on what we've just talked about, please do it in the chat window as well. And Craig, I'll put you on to the next slide now.
Perfect. Appreciate it. So again, I kind of hit upon what a learning platform is. And by the way, there are LMS vendors starting to add bots. I personally am not a fan. I mean, I use a bot for an AI bot when I do transcription. It does that kind of thing. And there's some things, but when you look at the consumer marketplace, overwhelmingly research is coming back that people hate bots. Those are those things that pop up and you ask the question and then the question isn't ever like, I don't understand. And then you're just wanting to, punch somebody in the face. So, there are vendors that are including bots that are in there. I'm just personally not a fan. So that's my kind of thing. When it's similar, not similar. And the approach is here is that, as I've said, more and more vendors are getting into this ubiquity where what I find is LXP vendors will say, I'm not an LMS. I'm not an LMS. And then when you start looking at the functionality, they're adding more and more functionality that an LMS has. And then the LMS vendor looks at it and says, you know what, I need to add the content. That's really the big piece here. I've got to have a marketplace. And to make a marketplace, you have to have partnerships with a variety of content providers. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. But I'm adding more and more of that to where it's visible so that I can say that. Another thing I'm adding is I'm creating this playlist experience. You're starting to see, well, I'm seeing it in the LMS market. They're starting to create playlists. They're starting to do that Netflix-like experience. They're starting to do, and on the flip side, you know, they're starting to add, like I said, assigned is coming in more and more that appears in the LXPs. And so I do believe there is crossover between the two, which is one of the reasons why I think when I look at LXPs, one of the big different factors is after it, they've been out, you know, a few years, and yet a lot of people in this, you know, and we see it here with this webinar, do not know what an LXP is. They don't know what the differences are. So to me, they've got a real, what I call a branding issue. You know, I've had friends in sessions, and they'll ask, like, does anyone know what an LXP is? And like 2 hands raise up. And one of the things that we're going on is that more and more people are just, they know the names. So I find it very common that somebody will say, hey, Degreed, or hey, Edcast, and they don't know that it's an LXP. Or they'll say, hey, Coursera is an LXP, but they're not. They're not an LXP. So there's a variety of kind of things, and nobody would say that if, you know, when I hear people say like Sabin, they refer to it as, you know, something other than it is, then that's one thing. But I've never heard someone say to me, you know, Fuse. I think of, when I think of LXP, I think of Fuse. Nobody says that. Most people actually, when they think of an LMS, they think of Fuse. But I'll tell you where I think they are at the end here. Sales Enablement Platforms. This is a segment. Some of the big names in there: Showpad, QStream, MindTickle. There's one about to be launched from the folks from Spoke, which Unbox Technology makes an excellent LMS. They're launching an SCP called Hub 360. And there's, you know, plenty of others that are out there. And what they focus on is they have a variety of sales functionality. So it's not just about learning, but they have a learning component. And that piece, or you want to call it a training component. And the focus is sales training, right? That's their primary focus. Some, that's all they do. But many of them will also say, look, you know, the system is designed for you to do call center or customer service training. So they hit both segments, but if you go to their sites, they're heavily driven by sales training. You'll find often a CRM into the platform. They offer a variety of, you know, collecting leads, which a CRM does, prospecting. They have all these kind of additional sales functionality. So it's trying to do both. Could you do that? Could, you know, but Salesforce is not a sales enablement platform. That's different than a sales enablement platform. And you can do you can do any of these things in other types of systems, but this is what they're heavily driven by. They have a coaching functionality that exists. This is where I talk into a webcam and then you respond back. And by the way, that's not exclusive to them. You find that in LXPs. You're finding that in LMS vendors as well. So they're all starting to add a coaching component, which they're spinning today as mentoring. Next slide, please. Scaling up. You know, people always talk about, well, I need to scale up. And today, as a whole, if you're doing that, an LMS is sort of, I think, a better route as a whole. Because, you know, when you're looking at it, an LXP is really ideal as a bolt or add-on. So you can do both. But, you know, what I find when people want to scale is they're looking at it tied to, you know, from a content standpoint. I mean, they're looking at it from an end user standpoint. So today I have 100, tomorrow I have 5,000, the next day I have 200,000, whatever it might be. And what I tend to find is when people talk about very large enterprise, which would be over 50,000 and more employees, That's when they're talking about scaling. And so it often is tied back to an LMS. But if you think about it, if I'm using an LXP as a bolt-on, I can handle both of those pieces, right? If I'm using an LXP as a standalone, even though obviously I can continue to grow as you're growing, because if I'm doing customer training, that's a little bit of a different story because they don't have certain functionality for that, even though they want into that market. Where an LMS as a whole, they tend to go, there are a couple of LMSs that only do employee only, but most of them can do either or. And there's factors for you to look at to find the right one that is better suited just for customer training. But from a scaling standpoint, that's as it goes. And what I always say to people on whatever platform you tend to use is don't look at where you are today, because that's just meeting the needs of today. Where are you going to want to be in 3 years? So I always say to people, they'll like, well, I have 2,000 people. Are you telling me you're going to have 2,000 in 3 years, or does your company plan on hiring people? You know, where do you want to be in 3 years? And one of the things I tend to find, and this goes into kind of the pieces of the variety of different platforms, is what I tend to find is that people will say, well, I don't want to have on-off sync, which ties to mobile. I don't want to have this playlist thing. I don't want to have this. We're not going to use that. But you don't know what's going to happen in a year from now or in 2 years from now. Or the person that's buying this system may not even be there a year from now. So you have to look at sort of not thinking about today, but, you know, as they say, think about tomorrow, about where that wants to go. Because if we relied on that, everybody would still be holding a handheld cell phone with a wire sticking out of it, right? I mean, up to a few years ago, nobody had a smartphone. Up to a few years ago, you didn't see people driving around with a Prius. Up to a few years ago, you didn't see, you know, AR apps available in an app store for Apple or Google Play. Right? You didn't see the latest version of Oculus Rift. You didn't see, the list can go on and on and on of things you never saw that you now are using. So if you as the consumer are doing that, why would you not want to have that with your system? And this is where I find issues, because people will say, oh, I don't like my system. And, you know, again, there's all those two main reasons, but they also will say, you know, oh, I realize I needed this functionality. It's too late. It's better to have it in the system. And if you don't want to use it, you turn it off. That's what's amazing about it. So, and then second thing is, what are you going to use the system for? If it's all about onboarding and you want to provide proprietary based content, then go to an LMS. If you're wanting to have it where you're saying, look, I want my learners to pick personal and professional development content, that's all I'm interested in. And I want to have it with all these different providers, and whether it's, you know, specific or not, I want to do that. Whether it's microlearning or not, whatever the buzz term is, I want to do that. Then look at an LXP. But you could also look at it at the same time with an LMS, right? It just depends on that level of functionality. If you're looking at an LMS and they don't have a marketplace and you're wanting third-party content, then look at the LXP. Or if you have an LMS and you're wanting personal and professional development content and you just want to have it more of a sync kind of piece, then look at an LXP. If you're all about video-based content, digital media content, then perhaps look at an LXP. These are kinds of those pieces that you're wanting to go into. Because really, if you wanted certain content providers, you can go to that provider. And that provider will work with your LMS or your learning platform and sync up so you can use that content. But it's a lot easier if the marketplace already exists and you can go ahead and select content. And by the way, more LXPs are starting to add content that's just beyond those pieces. They're adding workbooks. They're adding other types of assets that you can use. If you want a how to create a course, a built-in learning authoring tool, then you probably want to go to an LMS. And I just saw this question. I think in my past things, I've had Fuse listed as an LMS because when I look at the functionality that I have for an LMS, they hit every single one. They hit all the items that are in my template, which has 232 different functions. That said, if I was to do it today for my top 20 that's coming out in January, I would slide them under a digital learning platform because I think that's a better suit for what I perceive and see a digital learning platform becoming. So that's where I see that on the piece on there. But at the end of the day, you know, we in our industry, the learning system industry, have a problem is that we call things all types of things, and it creates a confusion. And then lastly, what is the skill gap? You know, when you talk about performance management, it's somewhat misleading. Skill gaps, one-on-one coaching, these kinds of things have always been around with every system. Not necessarily, not the coaching piece. That's relatively new. So the all kinds of other things, I mean, that's the whole point of having a learning system is skill gap. So to me, when I think performance management, I think succession planning. I think leadership development, which is in a performance management solution. So, you know, to me, I think that, and nothing against Fuse, I mean, I love the Fuse system. I really do. It's in my top 5 for 2020. But I think that it's better suited for meeting both, you know, when you say specifically about performance management, you take out that audience that's looking at customer training for your system. Next slide, please. And then just kind of last here, because we want to leave time for questions, we talked about enterprise and the different markets that are going in there in terms of that. So, you know, there are plenty of LXP vendors that go after SMB, but it tends to be often more kind of in the LMS. If they're going to do small business, small businesses tend to do a standalone for the LXP. And again, enterprise means whatever the vendor wants it to mean. There are plenty of vendors that will have 400, and you don't know that. So they'll say we have 200 enterprises, and let's say you have 20,000 employees. You're going to be impressed by that, right? So that's one of the factors on why they just will say, you know, we're an enterprise system. All that means is that when I hear that, I'm like, okay, big deal. I want to know what the functionality is to achieve. I want to know what their forward thinking is. I look at, as an analyst, I look at their roadmap. I look at their roadmap track record. I look at who's running the company and getting an understanding in terms of their level of knowledge of e-learning. I meet a lot of CEOs that have no idea why online e-learning was created. They have no clue. They have no idea why web-based training was created. And I've even found that with third-party content providers. So when a vendor says to me, he looks at enterprise, they're looking at it perhaps on some previous terminology. Last slide, please. So, I'm just going to kind of hit a piece here. Pricing, what is the cost? If you're having an LMS, you can have an LMS that's a multi-tenant where the parent is for your employees and the child is for your customers. And you can continue down the list. You don't need to have multiple systems. We talked about it. Pricing is going to be one thing that people tend to forget about LXPs is you need the content. So content is a cost, unless you're only picking free content. So when you're looking at an LXP, the same thing with LMSs if they have a marketplace. When you're looking at an LXP, look at how they find out about their pricing. It tends to be by seat, users, one username, one password. And then content is a separate cost. So you have to weigh that in. Okay, last kind of thing. And then I just sort of have a map. Next slide. And then here's where we're heading, and you can kind of go through that. If you have a legacy system, I'm happy for you, but you need to move over into the cloud and the types of pieces because vendors are no longer supporting that. So they'll let you keep it, but they're not supporting it. And then you're going to eventually get stuck in terms of some of these other things that you're wanting to go. And then lastly is my contact information. There you go. Thank you so very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Craig. I'll leave that up for a little while so everybody can jot that down, take a screenshot, whatever they need to do. Really interesting points you made there. And we've got a couple of questions that have come through in the chat as well. I think I just want to explore a little bit more, if you don't mind, about the fuse aspect. You know,
Sure.
I can imagine Steve sitting somewhere in the world now, sipping a cocktail, going, "We're not an LMS." I know you know the same thing as well. I think what's quite interesting about that is that when you said you originally put us an LMS, then you would say a digital learning system. What would you categorize as the difference between those two then? Just to
Between
clarify
which two?
Between the LMS and then you said the digital learning platform.
Well, the digital learning platform is just the rebranding of an LXP, because when people are buying content, what I tend to find is they're buying more and more video. Video streaming is in an LXP. That's a consistent that they all have. They all have, as a whole, the majority of them have a lot of video management capabilities, much more so than an LMS.
Mm-hmm.
And not all right? There are LMSs that have that, so I don't want to say that none of them have that. But they tend to have that quiz within the video piece. I mean, there are plenty of LMSs that have that. There's plenty of LXPs that have that. So that's not something that's, two kinds of pieces. But when you're looking at and again, I don't like the term microlearning because it's always been around. It's just a buzzword. And to me, if you're doing scenario-based learning, but one of the things that I'm looking at is video editors are coming into systems. They tend to be rolling into LXPs much more quicker than, say, an LMS market, because everything is driven around video. And when you're dealing with everything driven around content, right, within that marketplace, that's another kind of thing. So to me, digital learning has to include some level of digital media. Whatever that might be. Like if I'm all about ebooks, then I'm an ebook, right? I'm not going into there. And so when I look at these kind of solutions, there's one key thing I didn't mention, is that if I'm in K-12 or higher education, I'm better suited to an LMS, because an LXP is more driven towards the corporate market, and corporate would include associations. It would include anything that you're more interested. But if you're really big into adding your own content, right? You've created your own content and you want to put it into a system, you're better suited for an LMS. And this is because there are plenty of LXPs that do not allow you to upload your own content. It's not possible. They don't offer it. You have to have it on another server and you link out to it. So that's something that a lot of people don't realize. And that's kind of a factor that they have. So those are kind of the pieces that I think that are in there. And to me, and I've spoken to Steve on this, he doesn't think he's an LMS, but when I look as an analyst and I have to compare based on functionality, based on the product, and based on other factors, right? I can tell you that last year, you guys were pitching yourself as a next-gen learning ecosystem. You never said you're an LXP. You said learning ecosystem.
That's right.
2 years ago, you said you're an LMS, right? So, look, there are vendors that call themselves whatever they want to do. I've seen employee development programs, but nobody's typing enablement deployment program. No one says sitting around, hey, I need an employee development program. No one's saying that. Right. And so LXPs have this big issue where people don't know the term. So if you don't know the term, you're not going to be seeking it. Right. And what I've seen with plenty of vendors that say they're an LXP, and I've seen this with LMS vendors too, is that in the search engine, I find vendors that will say, I'm not an LMS, I'm not an LMS. And then you look at their keywords for search engine, they have LMS in there. Right. So when I'm searching, they're fine to be an LMS. But when I'm looking at it, and I think it's better suited personally for Fuse to be a digital learning platform. Last year, I listed them as an LMS. And I still feel that way. You can call yourself I'm not going to get into, kind of thing here with Fuse, but you can call yourself whatever you so choose to. But my point is that I find vendors that will say I'm a microlearning platform. And then the next year, skills is hot. Microlearning disappears. So to me, I think, look, the system is a learning ecosystem, but people will eventually misconstrue what that means. And I always say, why as an industry do we have to make it more difficult than what it really is, right? When you go and look for a car, you choose either a car, or if you're going to look for a vehicle, car, truck, moped, motorcycle, right? You're not looking for a skill ramp up with tires, right? You have very specific pieces. Same thing with houses, same thing with flats, same thing with everything else we do when we buy a product, right? When you're looking at a TV, you're either wanting a 4K TV or this kind or this kind. You're not looking for a tube that's got a bunch of circular wires in it. And that's what I'm saying, is that as a vendor, it is your responsibility to be the expert more so than the consumer, number one. Number two is that you have to define what you actually are and stay with it and not change based on whatever the thing is, because you can ask people and people will say in anything, right? Today, we're all about labels and we can choose all different types of things that we are, which is true, right? So, but you have to go based on, at least from my perspective, from an analyst standpoint, you have to stay the course. And that's why I think, you're an LMS, but looking at where I see the market going, I think digital learning platforms will eventually create differentiators. Today, as a whole, they don't. But I do think that in order to break out of the LXP and an LMS and everybody's getting the same RFP and people creating confusion, right? Innovation has to come from somebody. And I think a digital learning platform can do that, right?
Agreed.
For example, coaching. Today, if I'm doing coaching, I'm watching somebody record themselves and then the coach sees it and the coach texts back. They all do that. Why am I not seeing the coach doing the recording at the same time and they send it back, or doing something like that, right? That is a unique value. And I think digital learning platforms can pull that off. You have to look beyond what is available today to be unique. And that's where I think a digital learning platform can do that much quicker than an LMS.
Okay, sorry to stop you, Craig, but we're out of time. I think that's probably a to be continued. I like the idea of the digital learning platform. You mentioned the ecosystem, and that's something that we still do strongly believe in at the moment. But I'd love to carry on having this chat at some point as well. I just wanted to just turn attention, because at the end of the day, to the two questions. So we're going to follow up with both of those questions. So Craig and I will send an answer through. If we're also going to do a poll in a moment as well, if you want to just let us know your feedback on this as well. Craig, it's been really great to have you. Been really insightful for the last hour. I hope everybody has enjoyed the session as well. So Craig, just thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.